This is DW News, live from Berlin. A fourth night of rioting in France as the president struggles to respond to escalating unrest after the fatal shooting of a teenager. Emmanuel Macron condemns the violence and deploys more police to quell the protests. Also coming up, EU leaders failed to make a joint statement on migration policy after Poland and Hungary blocked the draft in protest against asylum reforms. And Brazil's top electoral court bars former President Jair Bolsonaro from public office for 8 years. I'm Michael Oku. Welcome. Violence and looting hit cities across France in a fourth night of riots triggered by the fatal police shooting of a teenager, although the protests were less intense than on previous nights. There were more than 470 arrests nationwide and pockets of tension in Lyon and Marseille in particular. France deployed 45,000 officers backed by armored vehicles to quell violence over the death of Nahel, who was shot at point-blank range during a traffic stop in a Paris suburb on Tuesday. The teenager will be buried on Saturday in the Paris suburb of Nanterre, where he lived and was killed. I'd like to welcome freelance journalist Linda Givtash, who joins us now from Paris. Linda Givtash, France's interior minister, says there's been a downturn in unrest in France, which of course doesn't necessarily mean it was a quiet night. How violent, comparatively, was the fourth night of protests in Paris?
Well, the violence has certainly changed, and it's changed in terms of where the incidents are happening. In the Paris region, it was quieter comparatively to other nights, but at the same time, countrywide, we've seen nearly 500 arrests, I think over 470 some odd arrests that we saw last night for various reasons, whether it came from the violence, people carrying Molotov cocktails, for example, in the Paris region would have been picked up by police. In Marseille, there was far down to the southern city, working class communities, we saw a lot more violence. There was looting this time in stores. So the incidents have changed, the locations have changed a bit in terms of where some of the clashes are happening with police. But again, as he described, it was toned down. That said, there were 45,000 police deployed across the country as well to contain the situation.
45,000 police. Overall, how did security officials respond directly? We hear that children as young as 13 have been detained.
Indeed, and there had been a call before, the evening to parents to ask them to, help out and convince their children to stay home, teenagers to stay home, to not participate in some of the action. And that said, we are still seeing these clashes. The security and police in this country have a very certain way of how they deal with actions when it comes to public unrest. They're still following their mandates and trying to keep the peace, obviously, and they follow a certain protocol of how they do that. And as we've seen, there's a significant amount of damage, cars damaged, buses. There was a curfew on bus and tram transportation around the country to try and make reduce the number of vehicles on the road, protecting the safety, obviously, of both passengers and drivers and staff, but removing those variables from being targets.
French officials, including the president himself, have appealed for calm. I'm curious about your take on this. Why aren't the protesters listening?
There's a lot of anger, and I think this comes on the heels of months of protests related to the changes in the pension reform. I'm sure some of your viewers have seen. We saw very similar scenes of violence when it came to anger over the raising of the age of retirement just a few months ago. So there is a certain, and there was at the time a lot of anger over how the police dealt with that how, there's an excessive use of force that was raised a question by the public, and I think that feeling is still there. That said, too, I've spoken to young men, because the question of and young people here over the question of racism and feeling targeted. And I think there is maybe in due course a need of a national conversation about how, who the police target, who's questioned more often. Because I've had young people say, and particularly young people from non-white descent, say that, indeed they feel more targeted than their white counterparts. And I think that's the anger that we're seeing this, and it's a reflection of a need to have a more open conversation about the role of racism in society here.
And we will end it there. Many, many thanks to journalist Linda Giftash.
Let's get more with Crystal Fleming. She is a professor of sociology and Africana studies at Stony Brook University and author of Resurrecting Slavery, Racial Legacies and White Supremacy in France. Welcome, Crystal. But we're seeing widespread anger as a reaction to the shooting. But tell us more about the context here. It's something which you have studied deeply.
Yes, there's widespread anger and anguish, specifically over the killing of this 17-year-old youth, Nahel, a French Algerian teenager. But this is also long simmering reaction to French racism, which is linked to colonialism. And both of those things are typically denied and erased by French authorities and politicians. That is to say, despite centuries of racial oppression of its minorities and colonized populations, the French government continues to portray itself as not racist. And so that is what people in these communities are living with. You have, in this case, a video recording of this youth being shot for simply driving their car. And this is causing a great deal of pain and anguish and anger, justifiably on the part of those who are living under those circumstances.
You mentioned a sense of denial from the government and authorities, but is there data to counter that?
Absolutely. I mean, even the French government itself in 2020, the French national ombudsperson released a report indicating that Black and Arab French people experience racial profiling and specifically are stopped by police 20 times more often than other French people. French racism has been studied extensively, not only by scholars, but also by organizations on the ground. The UN has released statements. The European Commission Against Racism and Intolerance has racism, and yet every time that we have seen studies done, reports done, and members of these communities speaking out about their own experiences, they are met with a wave of denial. And in this case, we even had the president, Macron, saying that the killing of this teenager was, something that was inexcusable, but also inexplicable. And it's not inexplicable. It's not a mystery. It's racism.
So what needs to be done? What needs to change? If you could put it in a sentence for us.
Well, one of the main things that needs to change is the law that empowers French police to shoot on motorists. This is something that happened in 2017, and since that law was passed, the number of French people has risen. French people killed by police has risen exponentially, and most of those people have been Black and Arab. So that's one of the most important things that needs to change. But beyond that, the French government needs to acknowledge that racism is real and enact policies to address it.
Sociology professor and author Crystal Fleming, many thanks for your analysis.
Thanks for having me.